I was a drug dealer for people who were, addicted to easy credit. I felt dirty every time I went to work. I have a background as a banker. I used to do commercial banking. I realized just how corrupt that whole system was, and I really do think that regulation it's a very tricky double-edged sword. Once a government official is elected, he has a burden towards the global financial standard setting bodies that supersedes what he has to do for the citizens of his country. We saw this wave of crypto projects and Bitcoin create new crypto millionaires who were not accredited investors. What if you can be added to a sanctions list, for spreading misinformation? I mean, that seems to be the direction things are taking now. And so that standard of being found guilty for the sole fact of being on a list is very, very troubling. So if that doesn't scare you, I don't know what will.
This rip of TFTC was brought to you by River. It's the best place to buy Bitcoin. Go to river.com/TFTC and enjoy this episode. What is up, freaks? First time I've opened the show with that in a while, and I think it's apt because it feels like we're getting back to our roots here, sitting down with an anon OpnState to talk about a subject that I'm very passionate about, which is getting to the root of these supranational regulatory guideline agencies that put out stringent KYC AML compliance regulations that get wantonly adopted by governments and regulators around the world. And from what I understand, OpnState has a lot of experience in terms of understanding what is happening behind the scenes and how this coordinated effort to thrust the digital panopticon onto the world, particularly the financial layer of the world, is happening. But before we get into that, why don't you introduce yourself, OpnState, why you're passionate about this, how you got into Bitcoin specifically, and felt compelled to come on the show today.
Sure. Nice to meet all of your viewers. This is my debut. Haven't done this before. By day, I'm a civil servant in a consequential jurisdiction. I do policy and legislation. I draft laws that pertain to financial services in my country. And by night, I'm a freedom-loving Bitcoiner that wants to help make the world a better place. So I have a background as a banker. I used to do commercial banking, where I managed fairly large businesses. They needed to have about $1 million of lending or more. So I was quite successful there. But gradually, especially after the 2006-2009 debacle, the great crash, I realized just how corrupt that whole system was and how the world needed to improve. So I felt dirty every time I went to work. I was a drug dealer for people who were, addicted to easy credit, and something felt wrong. So one day I decided to put my name down for a government role. I figured at a government agency, some kind of department that did policy and legislation, I could finally, change the world, make the world a better place. The incentives at the government would be very different. It's not about sales targets. It's not about, managing profit and whatnot. It's about doing what's best for the jurisdiction, or so I thought. So I put my name down as a kind of policy advisor in my country, and lo and behold, they needed somebody with banking experience, and so they took me on board. When I joined, full of hope, full of desire to change the world and to hit the ground running and change the laws that needed changing, they asked me if I knew what the FATF was, the Financial Action Task Force, and what I knew about AML. And at the time, I knew very little. But over the years, I've gotten to know AML quite well and how it's implemented. I've drafted probably about 12 pieces of legislation that implemented AML requirements in my country. And one of the projects that I was given was the development of a regulatory framework for digital assets in my country. And this was back in 2018, 2019, when this was all new. So knowing very little about Bitcoin, but having a strong desire to do good in the world, I dove headfirst into the world of Bitcoin. And I got to admit, I also did a little bit of Web3 and all those tokens, but realized, the cypherpunks really kind of resonated. The ideals and the values really resonated with me. And so I bought my first Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin was 6,000 or 8,000 at the time. Not that matters. But then I was tasked with doing the regulatory framework. And, I realized what I was doing. I went from one industry where I was, doing loans for people who are addicted to credit to being a cog in a global kind of effort to control financial services.
And was it a jarring experience going from private to public life with this intention of really fighting back against a system which you deemed to be parasitic? And that's a leading question, but was there a point at which you realized, or it seems obvious now that you're on here talking about this, that there certainly was a point, but what was that point when you went to the public side of things where you realized, I'm not actually going to be able to affect change in the way that I believed I was when I was coming over from the commercial bank?
Yeah, let's just dive right in. So the realization came when I saw how global standard setting bodies like the Financial Action Task Force, the WHO, the IMF, you name it. There's a plethora of different letter agencies and organizations around the world that set standards for countries, and they rule with an iron fist. When I was doing legislation, I thought that a country like mine would be able to freely draft the legislation that was right for the citizens, right, of that particular country. And I was wrong. It turns out that once a government official is elected, he has a burden towards the global financial standard setting bodies that supersedes the what he has to do for the citizens of his country. So countries are members of global standard setting bodies, or they've issued strong commitments to implement the standards that they develop. And so when a politician, I've seen two ministers now that I've been working under, and the first thing they do when they join is they quickly realize that if they don't implement those standards, then bad things happen. And bad things could be anything from being put on a gray list, which doesn't appear to be a big thing, or just having an increased or a higher risk rating when it comes to AML. And that has a huge consequential effect for jurisdictions that aren't, in the EU or the US or Canada or any kind of big normal kind of country in Western countries. So, we depend as a jurisdiction on correspondent banking relationships, right? And so if the country's put on a gray list or a blacklist, those correspondent banks, which are mainly in the United States, like, the big names like JP Morgan and whatnot, will look at the jurisdiction and say, well, look, the anti-money laundering risk in this particular country is elevated now. They were put on a gray list, on blacklist, and then the correspondent banking relationships start to fail, which means it's harder for merchants to buy goods, sell goods, ship goods, buy material. It's more difficult for people to get credit. Rates go up. US dollars, which have been used, by most, for global trade, are suddenly difficult to obtain. So there's a lot of examples of this happening. So as soon as a politician's elected, especially in the financial services world, they see this. And so their allegiance essentially goes towards these global standard setting bodies. And it's gotten so bad now that most of the private sector, which is the actors in the sector, in the financial services sector, like the banks or the funds or whatever the industry is, there's it appears as though they've just been whipped into shape now, and compliance and abiding by these global standards has become something that is lauded, and just you feel euphoric when you get a good rating, as a jurisdiction. Politicians will be super excited. They'll go up in front of the people in their country, and the people will applaud them for their excellent act of compliance to these global standards. And it, looking at all this as a bystander and being unable to draft legislation that, in my opinion, would have been better for my country. I couldn't deviate at all from the standards that were set for us. So it's kind of like saying, this global body says, all right, everybody needs to eat pizza, and each individual country can choose what toppings they want on their pizza. So whether it's pepperoni or mushrooms or anchovies, if you're weird, but you can't serve spaghetti or salad or chicken pot pie. It has to be pizza. So jurisdictions are dictated what they must do, and do it. And now you have, I can speak further on the FATF, which is kind of, I think it's necessary for your viewers who aren't maybe as familiar with that organization. But that's when it hit me. That's when I realized all of that.
Yeah, the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, which is a supranational guideline setting, the way I understand. So I'll say the way I understand, you can jump into more particular details. But I've been writing about this and talking about it for probably 4 or 5 years now, because I wasn't aware of them when I first got into Bitcoin. It wasn't only until they started writing guidelines for digital assets, probably around 2020, 2021, where I really started to pay attention. And that's what piqued my interest, is like, who is this Financial Action Task Force and why are they writing guidelines? And it really began to rub me the wrong way once I understood it's like an unelected, again, supranational entity that makes these guidelines. And the frustrating thing is they'll position and frame things like, hey, we're just writing guidelines here. It's not like we're writing the regulation. We write the guidelines, hand it over to the regulators, and then they decide whether or not they want to actually implement the guidelines that we set forth. But lo and behold, it seems like they're writing guidelines and people are just blindly applying them to their jurisdictions and their regulatory environment. And I think it's a massive problem that citizens around the world need to be aware of. You think that if you believe that you live in a democratic representative, if you believe you live in a representative democracy here in the United States or countries over in Europe and other parts of the world, like, you think that you vote people in and they make the guidelines. But as it pertains to financial regulations, particularly around KYC, AML, know your customer, anti-money laundering, there's this weird entity that operates out of France, I believe, that does all this.
So you're right. The FATF started in 1989, and it was an initiative started by the G7. And the original purpose was the war on drugs, right? There was all
very
this
successful war. Very successful war, by the way.
Oh, hugely. The more money you throw at it, the better. And I think the U.S. has succeeded in that fight. It's one of those forever wars. So that's how it started, and it was really to kind of stop money from drug sales from kind of entering the system and being laundered and used by criminals. And then it grew. It started growing as an organization, as a project, and especially when 2001 happened, 9/11. Once 9/11 happened, then it was like a blank check for this entity, right? This project to add whatever they wanted to add there to stop terrorism. So they added the requirement to stop money from terrorists from being used and integrated, and not only that, but the infrastructure was being laid at the time by those additions for kind of monitoring data collecting, and basically freezing funds without due process, right? You don't have to be found guilty of anything. You can just be suspected. Some kind of red flag pops up. I don't know. You said the wrong thing. Boom. Your funds are frozen. And it can take you a long time, as many of your viewers, I'm sure, know. Once you receive money and, it's frozen by the bank and they want to know the source of funds and that sort of thing. So in this world, you're assumed to be guilty. Your money is assumed to be the proceeds of crime until you can prove that it is not, right? And this flies in the face of hundreds of years of our ancestors fighting with their blood, sweat, and tears for our rights and due process, which I think is really being trampled here. To your analogy about these being recommendations, you're right. The FATF writes recommendations, quote unquote, but it also has a gun to your head. So it's like, I recommend you implement this, and if you don't, I'm gonna pull the trigger. It's a great way to get countries to volunteer and to follow your recommendations, right?
This episode was presented by River. River is the best, most secure place to buy Bitcoin in the United States. Go to river.com/TFTC, set up an account today. You'll be able to DCA into Bitcoin without paying any fees. You'll be able to give people Bitcoin via River links. You'll be able to send and receive Bitcoin over the Lightning Network, and you'll be able to set limit orders. If you want to buy Bitcoin at a particular price, below or above where it is now, you can set orders to buy Bitcoin when it hits that price. Go to river.com/TFTC and set up your account today. This episode of TFTC was also brought to you by Bitkey. Bitkey is Bitcoin made easy to use and hard to lose. If you're a hardcore Bitcoiner out there with friends and family members who have not gotten their Bitcoin off exchanges because they're worried about the complexity of hardware wallets, seed phrase backups, this is why Bitkey exists. Bitkey is collaborative custody. You have a ergonomic hardware device with biometric confirmation. You have the Bitkey app with a key in it, and then block holds another key in the server. This doesn't come with any seed phrase backups that people have to secure. You have social backup. It's a beautiful solution. If you're worried about the people in your life that aren't as advanced as you in terms of Bitcoin hardware and being able to set that up and secure it, Bitkey is a great first step. So tell them to get a Bitkey. Go to bitkey.world. Use the code TFTC20 at checkout, and they'll get 20% off their first Bitkey. I'm trying to think of where I want to take this, because even when we get to FATF, like at the root of all this is where we're going to take it. What I believe is like the Bank Secrecy Act here in the United States really lays at the core of a lot of these issues that we have talked about and will continue to talk about, particularly around KYC, AML, and I believe the BSA was signed into law in like 1971, funnily enough, 1970, 1971. That era was a Nixon era policy, if I recall correctly, and similar thing, obviously anti-money laundering. I think it was the first time it entered the lexicon, but that put some rules about knowing information about particular clients at banks, again, pertaining to how much money they were moving at any point in time. And it seems like over the years, particularly here in the United States, like the Bank Secrecy Act has been used and expanded, and things have been not added to the act itself, but the act has been used as an excuse to put more stringent compliance and regulations on companies outside the banking system, slowly but surely over time. And that turned into the fact that the United States economy is the largest in the world, and we're doing a lot of international commerce. It sort of pushed the entire globe, or the Western world particularly, towards this overarching compliance regime, which then brings in FATF, and it's sort of morphed into, again, this supranational regulatory, it's not officially a regulatory body, but essentially is a regulatory body pushing all these compliance and regulations down people's throats. And the worst part about it is it's completely ineffective. If you actually look at the amount of quote unquote money laundering that is prevented by these compliance measures, it's minuscule, and it completely neglects the fact that criminals are going to criminal. Criminals, by default and by definition, do not care about your laws. They're going to find a way to break it no matter what.
The initial, to your point, the initial kind of imposition of the United States' standards on the world was FATCA. Most countries, most non-U.S. citizens living abroad will remember FATCA, where, if they had a U.S. account in some Swiss bank or any other country in the world, they suddenly had to fill out a form, with some basic information, basically stating that they had they have no tax kind of liability to the United States. And that was the shot across the bow that started it all. And it's, as I mentioned earlier, it's devolved now into a frenzy. I in my years in this particular department, I haven't seen really anybody question the recommendations by the FATF. It's gospel. And it's sad to see that. As you mentioned, they're unelected. Now, the FATF does have a structure where countries meet. There's 40 countries currently which are full members, and they meet. They have plenaries, and they meet, and they look at the recommendations. They determine what should be added, removed, tweaked, and these deliberations take quite a bit of time. So there is participation from countries. However, the bureaucrats that go to these plenaries, they're not the elected officials. The elected officials go there. They're not the experts. They have all sorts of problems to deal with. So it's the bureaucrats, it's the people like me that will go to a plenary and submit some comments or some observations. And the worst part is that there are secondary members or observing members. There's 110 or so different countries that are secondary. So secondary means they can sit and observe in plenaries, but they can't speak. And so they have very, very little say on how the recommendations are drafted and forged and developed. So it's basically the rule of 40 countries on the rest of the world. And it's big. I don't see it going away anytime soon, which is, I don't know what somebody like me can do just coming on this show. But the circumvention of due process, I think, is the biggest issue here, and probably the angle that can be taken to maybe tweak anti-money laundering regulations. I think it's impossible to do in a period of emergency. For example, the United States is still under the 9/11 state of emergency, right? It's renewed every year. And so there's a lot of things that can be done under a state of emergency, especially if it's, 24 years going on, right? It's the war on terror that causes a state of emergency to be renewed every year. And just like the war on drugs, I don't think the war on terror is going anywhere. So this is a perpetual state of emergency under which basically anything can be done. Soldiers can be sent. I think I'm not an expert on this, but the US state of emergency from 9/11 allows your government to go and send troops without going through Congress, which is, problem in and of itself. But it also allows the collection of information, the circumvention of due process. And it's a big thing. And it's not just in the US. I'm not a US citizen. I don't live there. And now it's become global. So you may see it as a kind of a US-led initiative, but it's way beyond that now. This is a global standard-setting body which can now dictate what the US has to do. It's grown to that point. Surely the US has a big voice during those meetings, but it's not they don't have the ability to do whatever they want anymore. So from your perspective, you see the balance of power shift from, it shifted from the states to the federal government, and now it's shifting to a global organization. And so you are further removed as a citizen from keeping the people making the policy decisions and keeping them accountable. Good luck trying to find which bureaucrat went to the last plenary from your particular country, and then trying to find out what they suggested and why. And it becomes very, very difficult for governments to be held accountable if the policy decisions are being made overseas in a matter like this one. And we see this for, the WHO and the OECD. The OECD is the global standard setting body for taxes. They're implementing a global minimum tax, 20%. And so if your industry is, part of a taxable kind of industry, it doesn't matter where you are, you're going to be taxed 20% by somebody. Even if you go to a tax-free jurisdiction like BVI or the Caribbean, the BVI might not charge it, but other countries can, because it's what the OECD says that should be done. So it's concerning to me, and I think the whole system could benefit from some transparency and awareness.
Yeah. And to the point of this shifting from the states to the federal government to this overarching international, supranational conglomerate of bureaucrats making these decisions, we've heard a lot, I'm sure you have as well, about the public-private partnership and the idea that we really live in a corporatocracy. And that's one of the theories I've heard, is that the big banks and the big financial institutions actually like this compliance because it allows them to create these regulatory moats that make it hard for competition to break into their industries, and to take away some of their market share and user base. Is that what you're seeing on your end? Is part of this being driven by the large financial institutions around the world that want to create those regulatory moats and are more than happy to work step in hand in hand with these governments to comply with these regulations that are set forth, because they know at the end of the day they're going to benefit from it, because not many other institutions are going to be able to compete to pay for all the compliance that is necessary or all the boxes that need to be checked to be fully compliant to actually be able to operate in the first place.
I can't speak to that. I can only speak to what I see working in my particular little circle. What I see, in my country, is a growing burden of compliance. We have things like beneficial ownership now that has to be done. Reports have to be sent. We have international tax agreements with different jurisdictions. All of those things, it's like the boiling frog. It gets added and added and added. And in my jurisdiction, I know this regulatory burden is a burden. There's huge costs to complying with them. I think your comment stems from the fact that you're involved in Bitcoin businesses and alternative kind of financial services. And it's very possible that major banks have pushed organizations like the FATF to implement standards for crypto in general, or Bitcoin specifically, or digital asset services, in order to stop competition. I really do think that regulation is something that it's a very tricky double-edged sword. We're used to living with centralized regulators, but it's only been like that for about 100 years, early 1900s. And there's no doubt that a regulator, or having kind of a regulated industry, having standards that are applied, is a good thing. But like you mentioned, there's a fine line between, having standards applied in a sector and having powerful, lobbying entities create, walled fences for a particular sector or activity. So I can't confirm or deny that that's happening. From my perspective, the countries are complying with this, and the financial services actors within those countries see it as a burden. But they also see the consequence. They've seen the consequence in other jurisdictions that failed to comply, and now it's this, it's this theater where these financial services will go to, a conference and cheer and pat themselves on the back for being compliant. But really, how truly happy are they that these burdens are being added? And like you said, how many criminals have they caught? I know the study that you're referring to that speaks to AML, there's a few flaws with that study, but it is very, very difficult to measure quantitatively, how many criminals have been prevented to operate because of compliance standards. So, yeah.
Well, it's good to know that study was a bit off, because the one I'm referring to is I think it was being shared 3 or 4 years ago. Not at this point. It was claiming that 0.1% of global anti-money laundering volume was actually prevented by KYC AML compliance measures. And so knowing that stat may be stale, if not wrong, is it directionally correct, at least?
Yeah, well, if you have just a country neighborhood, right, your neighborhood where your house is, and you're plagued by thieves that come regularly, right, and you just post a cop car just on one of the street corners, with the lights on, right, so it's obvious that there's a police presence in your neighborhood now. What do you think the thieves will do? Will they try and, they might try and avoid the police car and still rob your neighborhood? Oh, they'll just go somewhere else, right? So how effective was that police car if it didn't, arrest any criminals? But just for being there, it might have prevented quite a few break-ins from happening. So it's the same thing for AML. It's like shining a light in a dark room full of cockroaches, and you might see 1 or 2 skitter, but there were 100 there. And so that's why it's very difficult to quantify. If you ask me, as defined by the anti-money laundering definitions and the standards, it certainly has made it harder for these quote-unquote criminals to operate. But I also see lots of legalized criminal activity, but no longer criminal, legal activities which are very questionable, happening in major banks, or at least I hear about them. I don't see them. People speak of major banks, facilitating powerful individuals, moving money for them, doing loans, doing opaque structures so that the police can't find, who ultimately owns the money that's being transferred. Those kind of activities do happen. And they, more often than not, it's just a small fine that the bank can easily, pay. So this kind of in-your-face application of AML, it's like a double standard. You and I, we're little plebs. We're going to be questioned to death. But certain individuals, it's like, you're good to go. I haven't seen this myself. But that's what I think is happening right now.
Yeah, I mean, we just know off of public information, like Jeffrey Epstein specifically had accounts at JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank after he was released from jail for being a convicted sex trafficker, and they still did business and allowed him to make wires. That should have probably been flagged by AML, but that was only brought to the surface after he quote unquote died a few years ago, whenever that was. But yeah, there's always this double standard. And earlier you mentioned is this what you were alluding to earlier when you said there's this circumnavigation of due process, or is that completely unrelated? The sort of implementation of these regulations from the supranational unelected bureaucratic body is circumnavigating due process. Is that what were you focused on that double standard earlier, or is this circumnavigation of due process completely separate from what you were just describing?
It's not separate, it's integral, but it's ever present in everything related to AML. So, from my insider view, I see the types of conversations that take place. For example, I'll just mention the sanctions lists that were updated. So I'm sure your viewership is familiar with what a sanction is. They may not be familiar with the lists that are being maintained by the UK, the EU, the US. Those sanctions lists, individuals are added to those lists because a particular government doesn't want those individuals participating in society. Now, what are the reasons for that? Are they convicted? Have they gone through due process? Maybe, maybe not. Probably not. Have they been gone to trial? Have they been in front of a judge? Probably not. So these people that are added, in whatever state legislature you have, or parliament, somebody suggested that they be added. A couple people looked at the business case and then rubber stamped it, and then now they're added to a sanctions list. Now, governments around the world, Western jurisdictions, are compelled by the FATF and the standards to look at those lists and to deny anybody on those lists from participating in society. And this means confiscation of bank accounts, freezing bank accounts, confiscation of real estate, denial of travel. And from my perspective, when the sanctions lists were added because of the conflict in Ukraine, some Russian individuals were added, in the U.S. sanctions list, the U.K. and Europe, and other countries were compelled to implement the measures to prevent these people from participating in society. Now, are these individuals, have they been found guilty of a crime in my country? No. Does my country review the lists and, fully assess what these people have done, with our country's standards, for what a crime is and is not? No. These lists are taken as some kind of gospel. And I saw personally, assets being frozen and taken away, and, without question, with glee even. It was a humbling experience to see that, reports were written, committees were set up, to make sure that these individuals weren't, in the jurisdiction or using, corporate entities in the jurisdiction. And, you have a person with 10 passports around the world, being added on a list, and suddenly you don't know if they have a different name somewhere else. And so, if the sanctioned individual's name is, John Doe, now he could be Bob Doe, now he could be, Bob John. And so governments will look at those lists and say, well, all right, what permutations, can these names take? There's huge consequences for non-compliance if, a country is known to have allowed, John Doe from using a corporate structure, or flying in, or there's a yacht there, or a private jet, or whatever, bars of gold in a vault somewhere in that jurisdiction. There's huge consequences for that jurisdiction. All of a sudden, now it's the word's going to spread that that country is a safe harbor for criminals. They'll be added to a gray list. Maybe they'll be reviewed negatively, and all of that happens without due process. And the worst part is, to your public-private partnership point, banks and financial institutions have to take the highest level of due diligence when looking at these sanctions lists. Now, what happened in my country was that, we don't know if John Doe has a different passport from another jurisdiction, calling himself Doe John, or even Bob John, or Mr. Fridge, we're just going to prevent all Russian passport holders from interacting with our financial institution. Right? Problem solved. It's the least amount of, they want to minimize the risk, right, of being fined, of being found to be non-compliant. All the banks realize that if they're non-compliant, and I'm talking banks in general, there may be some that don't care, but at least if you ask them, or if you look at them and you see what they do, they'll jump on this, and they'll just ban every Russian passport holder. Now, in my country, I had a Russian neighbor, and I was a single mom, and when this happened, she wasn't able to send money through the SWIFT system. She couldn't. She had to find a way to get money just to live and pay rent and that sort of thing, and she couldn't. She basically had somebody else somewhere else buy her tickets, and had to leave my country. Now, was she on a list? I highly doubt it. Maybe she was, but knowing her name and having seen the lists, I didn't see her name there. So how is that for due process for you? What do you think? Do you think that's a great system? There's a lot of collateral damage, and the worst part is, your viewers will love this. What if you can be added to a sanctions list, for spreading misinformation? I mean, that seems to be the direction things are taking now. You can be a subversive kind of disinformation spreader, and so be added on the list. And suddenly now, it doesn't really matter where you go, there will be consequences, and life will be much harder for you. And so that standard of being found guilty for the sole fact of being on a list is very, very troubling. It completely subverts due process, and it forces a country's standards on every other country that participates in the scheme and abides by those sanctions. So if that doesn't scare you, I mean, I don't know what will. The standard for being added on, or being found being subversive, me just being on this podcast. Well, look, I spoke against government. I questioned some things. Nothing that I've told you is top secret. Nothing that I've told you is, I haven't told you anything. I'm just talking about my experience and what I've seen. I'm not revealing any secrets. But, one of the reasons I'm wearing this mask today is so I can speak my mind without having to worry about, the next 10 years and how this system will evolve. Certainly, if there is a bad government actor and the right opportunity, the framework is in place for complete control, not just in the financial markets, but also in travel and in health. That's being implemented now, right? So what do you think? Is that proper due process?
No. And it's actually reminding me of an episode we recorded earlier this year with Carlino from Simple Proof, and he walked us through the story of how his family ran a construction business for 30 years, and they, by accident, got put on one of these lists, and it destroyed their family business because they couldn't get access to bank accounts. They couldn't operate for 2 years, and they had to go bankrupt for a simple mistake of being put on the list they never should have been on. And that's like a prime example in my mind of what you just described, like somebody getting thrown on this list and having their life ruined without due process, and destroyed a generational business that his family depended on for 30 years. It's insane. You're just going around with a sledgehammer, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, if you will. Because as you mentioned earlier, like there may be a need for proper regulations to make sure that there's standards and people are not living in the Wild West and do have some assurances when they're interacting with third parties. But I think it's more than safe to say that things have gone a bit too far. The overreach is extensive at this point, and I could make the argument it's doing more harm than good, considering the fact that you can be put on this list and your life can be flipped upside down in an instant. And then on top of that, the data collection. All these institutions have been proven to be woefully incompetent when it comes to actually securing this data. And we've had hack after hack after hack. We had a hack of a government system here in the United States earlier this summer that leaked 3 billion pieces of data on individuals across the United States. So you got social security numbers, addresses, phone numbers, email addresses out there. And that's bought and sold by criminals on the dark web to target individuals. I mean, we see it every day, every week in the Bitcoin and broader crypto industry with all these phishing attempts and people either stealing identities and taking over exchange accounts or levying phishing attacks because they get access to this information because it's not protected sufficiently. And there's got to be a better way. And that's the main question in my mind, and I'm interested to get your opinion. Like, do you think this is nefarious in nature or pure incompetence, bureaucrats just thinking they have a job to do, thinking they're genuinely doing good things in the world, and doing what they do as middle bureaucratic managers, adding more compliance because they need busy work to do? Or is it more nefarious in nature where these entities or the people behind them seek control over individuals and individuals' ability to move money and operate throughout the economy?
Well, let me flip the question to you. You invest in, many companies. To what extent do you want information on what your employees or the employees of the companies you invest in? To what extent do you want information on their daily activities? If you are okay trusting your employees, and just getting the job done, and you let them do it, you're a very good leader, you're a good manager, and I want to work in one of those companies. Other people, and we can talk about how the current governmental system, the whole government infrastructure, puts incentives, right? The way that the incentive structures are in government right now. I'll take an example in Canada, right? I think Justin Castro, the Prime Minister of Canada, I think his wage is $180,000 a year, something like that, maybe $250,000 a year, something like that, whatever it is. You get what you pay for. You look at a large CEO of a company, and they're going to be making $3, $4, $5 million, whereas the leader of a country makes $250K. So the incentive structure in government will attract either people who are completely willing and able to give their time, or will attract people who are aware that there's other ways of making money. And so it invites corruption and other kind of sinuous ways of making an income. You've seen in the US lots of individuals, just their net worth is doubled, tripled, 10x'd while they're in positions of power. It's not because of their wage. And so the incentive structure tends to attract individuals who are either very charitable with their time or crooked. And so do you think, people who are, I would say, encouraged by the incentive structure of government to seek payouts and, $500,000 internships for their nephews and that sort of thing, people who are like that, do you think they're going to be good leaders and good managers and, not want to know perfect information on the citizens so they can control it? And, if you're a guilty soul, if you know deep inside that your conscience isn't, something's not right, you're going to project that on others. To answer your question, though, is this nefarious? I think it's the way the system is designed. I think, as I said, the incentive structure in government, should change. If you paid, I know this is very controversial, most voters will hate this idea, but if you paid the leader of a country, the equivalent of, what a CEO makes for a big corporation, a couple million or whatnot, individuals will join and want to take on those roles and be adequately compensated, and you might get better quality in terms of how, who joins the government. And so is it nefarious? I'll answer your question. I haven't seen anything specifically in my years in government to say, yep, look, these people know what they're doing. They know they're acting maliciously. They know they're doing this for a purpose. There's the Klaus Schwab in the background, rubbing his hands. I haven't seen that. What I do see is a misaligned incentive structure in government, attracted a certain type of individual who then go on and, do what they do and do it badly. And I can also speak, if you want, on how organizations like the FATF, make governments comply to the standards, which also plays into this, because it's not, in my particular country, it's not one or two individuals just saying, oh, this is something we want to do. And no, it's a very organic, self-feeding, Leviathan that has a very beautiful carrot and a very strong stick, in its tentacles. So yeah, that's my point of view on there. I knew you were going to ask that question, and that's the best answer I can give you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question I ask a lot too. Many guests, because I flip-flop back and forth. I can see the fair. Obviously, there's been stretches on the show with particular guests where it's nefarious. These people want to control you, and then I think I'm right now more in the camp of what you just described as the incentives are out of whack, and if you create a system with particular incentives, you're going to get a particular outcome, and it seems like we set up an incentive structure, like going back to the politicians in their pay, where their incentives are out of whack. Only sociopaths who crave power and are willing to bend the rules in their favor would go get that low-paying job because of all the status that it comes with, and the favors that can be given out and the backs that can be scratched. And so, yeah, I think setting up the right incentive structure, and to answer your question, flipping it on me, like as an investor in private companies, like I don't need, again, good incentive structures. Private companies either provide a good service to the market, and if it doesn't drive demand, you don't raise any more money, and if it does, you make a lot of money, and you're highly incentivized to make sure that you're delivering that product to the customer and treating your customer the right way. So I think incentives are aligned for most private businesses that actually want to go out and provide a gooder service and make a profit. But yeah, when you
get a pat on the back for that one. Good job.
Yeah. The government, I don't care what individual you invest in, a team, a leader, because you believe that they're competent enough to decide for themselves who they need and what they need to build their product or service. And then the government too. There's one point I wanted to bring up. There's no accountability. In the startup world, private market world, there is accountability where if you don't provide a good service and you don't have any product market fit and you're not gaining cash flow, particularly under Bitcoin standards, you're just going to go bankrupt. But in the world of government, you have this money printer, which allows you to be completely unaccountable. You can paper over all your mistakes pretty easily with a treasury auction or a Fed bailout, whatever it may be.
That's a true statement, specifically and most especially for the United States. You'll find that other jurisdictions around the world, can't necessarily print money the way the U.S. does, and so there's a higher degree of accountability there. The asymmetry of information, is growing. Who knows what about who, right? When it comes to governments knowing more about you, and versus you knowing something about the government, there's a growing asymmetry there. And of course, knowledge is power. It allows you to play better chess if you know what your opponent's doing or why they're doing it, and what they're doing, and kind of look into their brain. And you're completely right. I mean, I have a hat that says open source the government. I mean, I think about this, quite a bit. There's a lot of big, massive changes that can be, enacted. For example, if a politician or even civil servants in general, got a bonus each year based on how well the economy that they, supervise. I don't like using that word, but the economy that they're active in. If the economy does well, then they get a bonus. I mean, how hard or difficult is that to do? If the economy does bad, they don't get that bonus, right? Like just something that easy to do. You think would be easy to do, but it isn't. And so the accountability, those kind of big, easy, low-hanging fruit, you would think changes are actually really hard to put in place. And so I look at what can you do? So I got a question for you. Hopefully I don't want to be all doom and gloom. I'm going to ask you a question. Have you ever sent a Freedom of Information request, Marty?
I have not. Not at the federal level. Right? I've done one at the state level, but not at the federal. Good for you. That's more than most people. There's 110 different jurisdictions around the world that have freedom of information legislation. And that legislation is backed up by an ombudsman, a review process. Sometimes, it's got a basis in the constitution of that particular jurisdiction or the founding documents. It's very, very easy to use. I mean, I looked in the state of Texas where you're located. You can send a freedom of information at the state level, like you already know the process. It's just a letter. It's just a simple letter. You can create, you can call yourself Monkey Banana, Mr. Big Fridge, create an anonymous, email and send a letter. And you say, I'm Mr. Big Fridge and I want to get all the emails of this or this particular department or person, emails that pertain to this or that. I mean, how easy is that? And it's free in most cases, unless what you're asking is going to take, a considerable amount of time. And you don't have to justify why you want that information. You can just say, I want the emails of, Frank, who works in the Lands and Survey Department, between this period. You don't have to say why. You can just get Frank's emails. And like how much transparency does that give? It's huge. So why don't people do it? I've sent probably about 4 or 5 different FOIs. I got an example for you. Whenever an FOI is received by a government entity, if it is a person, if it relates to a person within the government, so you're asking Frank's emails,
Frank will be notified. If Frank's going to get a notice one day, hey, there's an FOI that says, we should disclose all your emails from this and this date. Like how do you think Frank, will react to that? I mean, government emails, are public record. And he probably used his email to order pizzas or, say goodnight, to his wife or whatever. And maybe, said a few things that he doesn't want people to know, made a few comments. That puts him in line, even if the emails aren't sent for whatever reason. He is now more aware and aware of the consequences of his actions for the simple fact that somebody in that, location sent a freedom of information. During COVID here, during the lockdowns, our public health person was targeting children quite heavily, giving gifts and that sort of thing. It was a very sketchy individual who had, questionable background and history and whatnot. So, I just sent an email with an FOI request in it, asking for every email that contained, the word, Pfizer vaccine and whatnot, for a specific period. Literally that week, the guy completely went dark. And about a month later, left the jurisdiction, left the country. I didn't get the emails. The feedback that I got was that the request is overly burdensome for that particular department or whatever. And I could have pushed that, to be fair. I could have gone to the ombudsman. It's not the justification they gave me not to give me the emails wasn't sufficient. I could have pushed. I didn't because the guy left. And it's just, if you want to keep a government accountable, why the hell aren't you sending FOIs? I mean, literally anything you want to know, you can find out. I mean, unless it's specific cases like a negotiation or something that would be considered to be kind of very dangerous or would harm the jurisdiction as a whole if it went public. I mean, you've seen big FOI cases with everything blacked out, et cetera. But as an individual, keeping unelected individuals accountable is done by FOIs, and you should send one tomorrow. Your viewers should send one. Is there something that you're kind of scratching your head and going, why did the government do this? Why did they say this? Why did they sign this contract? Why did they build this road? Why are they a member of this or that organization? Heck, how many people in this particular department went to the latest World Economic Forum meeting? You can FOI agendas. Why don't you? You'll know everything about them and about the people who are drafting and building policy in your particular kind of region. And you can do so anonymously. I mean, why wouldn't you? Do it now, right? So that's a tool that we have as, freedom-loving individuals to really affect change. And I'm telling you, you might not get the info that you sent, that you requested, but it will keep people accountable just for the very fact that you sent it. And if people don't do it, well, fine. It just means they don't want to know, right?
Yeah. No, and I completely agree. In the American context, there's redactions that a lot of these FOIA requests come with. And then I think the Freedom of Information Act has been leveraged, particularly by journalists, in a very good way over the last 10 years. I would say, post WikiLeaks, post Snowden, people really began to understand that the Freedom of Information Act was there and that it should be used. But to push back a little bit, a great example, going around the vaccine and COVID here in the United States, they FOIA requested all the emails at the NIH, I believe, between Fauci and it came out that they were explicitly in those emails, like say, like using a $sign for an S to make sure they couldn't search a particular name, and telling people on chains that they shouldn't be communicating with these email addresses, and nothing came of it. So like, I agree, get the FOIA request and surface the information. But I think that's one thing we have yet to figure out, particularly here in the United States, is the way the media works is they're not going to surface this data. It typically lives on social media and what are considered to be fringe accounts or independent media organizations that do get this information, but nothing ever comes of it. I think the Fauci NIH early COVID response FOIA request that came out earlier this year or last year is like a prime example of that.
Those emails, and I'm aware of them. They're very high visibility. You're targeting the Goliath. You're targeting the kind of the biggest actor. Think smaller, think local. Fauci, for in all his wisdom and omniscience and presence in government, is unlikely to be the one actually making the decisions. Not because there's a shadowy person standing behind him, but just for the fact that he has a lot to deal with. And so he has a team of bureaucrats drafting policy for him and suggesting, actions. And those individuals are like me, completely behind the scenes. And because, somebody under Dr. Fauci, he's under Dr. Fauci, maybe that person doesn't feel like they have to be accountable for anything, because if anything ever happens, well, it's Dr. Fauci who did it, right? And so doing an FOI for somebody like that, and doing an FOI for every single person within Fauci's team or whatever department. So I know that you target, we have an instinct to target kind of the head honcho, but it is very much a self-running machine. I mean, look at the U.S. now with, Biden, his current state, and the vice president is out, doing interviews and knocking on doors. Who's managing the country? Well, it's people like me. It's certainly not those individuals. So, somebody like Dr. Fauci, you can FOI, Biden's emails. You can FOI, the VP's emails, Kamala Harris, or somebody big like that, but they're not the ones making the real decisions. And that's just for the very fact. It's not because there's a nefarious element at play. It's simply for the fact that they have a lot to deal with. And so you might, FOI your elected official that it's Bob Doe, and he's the one that you voted for, and now he's not doing what you want to do, so you're going to FOI him, and why did he do this? That's great, but you might have to dig a bit deeper to really get to the information, A, and B, to effect change. Because as long as there is a veil, protecting individuals who are actually doing policy, in a role like mine, it's difficult for them. They're only beholden to their conscience. And most people, and whether it's justified or not, think that civil servants and government employees have cushy jobs and they get paid tons of money. It might be true in some cases. I can guarantee you that as a whole, it really isn't. There's a certain level of safety to working for government. You're less likely to be held accountable, and kind of, how many reports did you write this year? And there's no weekly kind of goal sessions that a private sector would have. And so there is that, and pensions might be good, but you see many examples of a revolving door between civil servants and industry. Well, why do you think that happens? Why do you think somebody would, work at a government job for a few years and then switch to big bank or big pharmaceutical company or whatever? It's because the pay is higher. right? So every single civil servant who is, even a little bit kind of desirous of more money, and they're aware of that, and so they'll act accordingly. That's the incentive, right? The pay is disproportionate in some certain circumstances, and in those particular circumstances, that's where you'll see more, nefarious kind of actions. And getting emails, getting agendas, getting reports goes a long way for a population of a jurisdiction or a certain area to know why their government's doing things. But you do have to dig deeper. And so you'll hear about the Dr. Fauci emails. But if you're going to send an FOI, send it to find out who's a member of a team. Ask for any emails within a particular department that has a certain, word in it. And that's how you send the FOI.
Yeah, that's good info. Yeah.
The government system, I might be taking this on a tangent, but there is a our current political system is very, very interesting. And I step back sometimes and just look at it. Well, you participate in a voting process. I mean, I assume you've voted, right, Marty?
Yep.
Right. Yeah, you vote, right? So you participate in that process. And to what extent are you enabling the system? And I know you basically vote for somebody, person A, and then you cross your fingers, hoping that person A will do what you want them to do, right? And oftentimes they don't. So the majority of the people around the world, not just in the US, are disappointed by the current system, the government system. And it's an interesting relationship that voters have with their government. So their government might go out and send 1,000 bombs and kill 100,000 people in some other country for whatever reason or excuse. It's my belief that everybody who voted in that election, not for the person, but voted in that election, are partially responsible for that action that the government took. I think society as a whole, and people might not like hearing this from me, are very lazy. And so electing somebody every 4 years is a way for you to voice what you want, very weakly, because you can only really vote between two choices, which are sometimes not very different. And so you vote, and that's your way of expressing what you want, and then you can just step back. Right? There's a feeling now that the government is a thing. It's an actual entity. It's not. It's a construct that gets its power by people participating in it, and you participate in it by voting. And so I look at that as a whole, and wonder, to what extent are you responsible for government's actions if you participate in it? What would happen all of a sudden? I mean, right now I don't know the stats, especially not in the US, but say half or 51% of the people get off their asses and go voting. Right? Now that means that the government has it's fairly legitimate. There's a small majority of people in the country that support the process. Well, maybe there's a vote against the process, and that's not to vote. I'm not saying don't go vote. I see your candidates in the U.S. I know which way I would lean. However, how much change is that really going to affect? You're going to have, on one hand, you have a kind of a socialist individual, and on the other hand, you have a person who's going to put everything in the private sector. Putting big private sector names in positions of power, and whether that's good or bad. I mean, I've listened to your Whitney Webb interviews. She's better placed than me to talk and hypothesize about that. But imagine all of a sudden if only, I don't know, 5% of the population voted. Just doesn't matter for who, just only 5% voted. 95% of the people didn't vote. Whoa, what does that mean, right? I think, is it likely to happen? No. But as a conscientious individual, I kind of sit back and think about those things. And to be fair, I think the system is misaligned and needs some heavy changes. And I believe, my message to your viewers is to start with the FOI process, and let's just get some light and some accountability, and just let's flip the asymmetry of knowledge from government to the people. And there's a system in place for everybody to participate and do that. So I've seen situations where people are, requested, they might speak their mind and say, well, I'm not happy about this, I'm not happy about that. But when it comes to just writing an FOI, it's a simple little email, oh, I can't do that. Oh, yeah, I'll do it next week. Life takes over. And so this kind of attitude is also reflected in, the current voting and government system that most Western countries have. You express your desire once every 4 years, and then you kind of sit back, and most of the times you're disappointed. Well, how rewarding is that? People need to take action. You need to stop delegating your conscience to one individual. You can still vote, go ahead and vote, but also take action around you. Stop relying on media or big names, like Marty Bent, to have those important discussions. Go out and have them with your neighbor, right? We've delegated even the responsibility of discussion to the media and to, big name influencers. Really, we stopped talking to our neighbors. We might talk with our friends, over a steak dinner, but it used to be that political policy decisions were discussed, at town halls and locally, and that discussion needs to take place locally. You talk to your neighbors. Do you know your neighbors? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. Your squash club, your pickleball club, whatever. I think it's important for people to kind of have a bigger open mind. But sadly, what I'm seeing is that's very, very hard to do for the majority of the population. So I'd love to know how many people go out and send an FOI after viewing this. I think we can only do what we can do. I can do what I can do, which is to come on a show like this and to express what I see, my observations, and to give you a solution. And I can't do more than that. I can't force anybody to take action, but hopefully that's enough to win, like you're so fond of saying. We're
gonna win. No, and I completely agree. This is incredible conversation. And that's like, I was a big never vote. Voting doesn't have any effect on the outcome. They're gonna do what they do, but last few years, particularly now that I have children and have more skin in the game in terms of exposure to the ramifications of particular regulatory regulations that do or do not get pushed through. Like, I've been forced to participate, whether that's voting in local elections. Did not go our way this time in Austin, but there was a DA election earlier this year that I felt compelled to vote in. It did not go our way, but it did feel good to sort of voice that opinion with a vote. But outside of voting, in the Bitcoin industry, particularly Bitcoin mining, that's something I've become way more engaged with in the last few years, particularly at the intersection of energy policy and Bitcoin mining. And it really became clear to me, despite the fact for the longest time I was a disenfranchised American who grew up with 9/11, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, WikiLeaks, Snowden, COVID, you may not care about political power, but political power cares about you. And when it comes to Bitcoin and being in the mining industry specifically, it was like a fight or flight decision that I think many people in the industry have realized over the last 4 years, specifically as the industry has shifted over to the United States after the Chinese mining ban. You have to engage, and there are things that you can do. I mean, one of the FOIA requests, that it wasn't FOIA, but the Freedom of Information requests that we did at the state level here in Texas around during the last legislature, I believe it was at the beginning of this year, had to do with lobbying efforts on behalf of one individual legislator, try to push through a bill that would basically make Bitcoin mining operations engage in demand response within the Texas grid, second-class citizens, burdensome taxes. And the funny thing is, we did a Freedom of Information Act or Freedom of Information request. Parker Lewis officially made the request, but we sort of game planned it, and it came back. There was no emails about this particular topic. So that's another thing too. If you do these Freedom of Information requests, and you do get a response and it comes back, hey, they didn't talk about this and they're pushing a bill, like that's evidence that they obviously had conversations outside the purview of their state sanctioned email, which they're supposed to be using for these activities. And I don't think we pushed it this far because the bill didn't get passed through, but if it did, it's like, all right, is this individual legislator working outside the system and doing deals behind closed doors? Why wasn't this discussed publicly via the proper communication channels?
Yeah, I'm not saying it's a perfect solution.
Yeah.
That's
a solution to the problem. If you get a request and it's like they never talked about this, but they produced a bill that was very specific, like it's like, okay, then you push it up the ladder more. Like it's obvious that you had to have some conversations about this particular activity somewhere.
Most avenues that anybody can use, like WhatsApp or a personal private email, are also FOIable if the subject matter being discussed is public policy, right? And so, I mean, you could choose to go to the ombudsman and push it if you have kind of a good reason to believe that it was discussed, and or target somebody differently, within the team. There are ways of pushing it, but I can guarantee you that just sending the FOI or whatever you did, they were notified of that, and whether or not it influenced the decision. Again, it's one of those AML things, hard to quantify. And I hope the decision went, positively for you and your purposes. But it did have an effect. I guarantee you, if I get an FOI on my emails, you can bet that'll be a little shock in the ass. I'm going to be, okay, people are watching. People know I exist. I got to be careful here. And that's how unelected government bureaucrats will react if you send an FOI. Do it. Keep us accountable, by all means.
Yeah, and you mentioned this being like a first step into better incentives within the government. Like what else I noticed in the notes that you sent me, like ideas around open source regulatory standards. Like, do you think from a technical implementation perspective, there's things that we can be doing better to drive more transparency and accountability at the government level?
You're asking specific to the government level, but let me bring you back to the cypherpunks and the mailing list, and look at how that development took place very organically, and how Bitcoin was released very anonymously. Did anybody ask government whether they could do this? Did anybody, maybe it's a CIA, person. I don't know. I don't care. The fact is, it's a good system. It's great technology. It has really, really useful use cases, and it was developed without any kind of regulatory, framework. So when you start a new business, you have a new venture, you're gonna create some kind of legal entity, a corporate entity, and that makes you governable. Why are you doing that? I mean, I know why. There's tax issues. There's liability issues that you may be concerned about. There's a lot of good reasons why you would use an existing corporate structure that's well understood by investors. There's also very good reasons now, and growing reasons, why somebody should just develop anonymously and release new technologies anonymously and not ask government for permission. You've seen the recent arrests and whatnot with certain developers. I see this as a growing trend. There's talk in my circles of KYD, which is know your developer. If you're contributing code now, you'll have to be kind of fully doxed, and it with the kind of actions that are being taken against developers and certain projects, as a developer, you're taking on a huge amount of liability. If you open your code and anybody can add code to it, you might be liable for the ultimate product, even though you had you didn't submit any code towards the project. And so all those entities that you are incorporated under are governable entities. It allows the government to collect information on you, to know who you are. It allows the government to come in and put its nose in your particular project. And believe me, the infrastructure is in place for full exchange of information on an international level. The tax information agreements that countries have with one another, the countries are compelled to share any kind of information that they have on file, or even if it's not on file, they have to get it and send it when a request is received. Is that how you want to operate as a freedom-loving individual? Now, it works if the government's honest and accountable. That's great. Then you have great use for corporate entities. It makes sense. You can trust that you're not going to be acted on unjustly. Everything's great. Hallelujah. I do believe the trend is the other way, unfortunately. So as an industry, developers and new projects may want to open up an anonymous account on Nostr, and stop using GitHub, which is owned by Microsoft, and we'll ask for 2FA. If you contribute a certain amount of code, and which is used eventually to track who you are. In some cases, I'm told. I have no evidence of this, but and so as an industry, I looked at regulation. Right, so you have the SEC, you have all those, the centralized regulators around the world, and I see them being very, very pissed at Web3 and crypto over the last few years, because it allowed Joe Blow, average individual, to participate in, what it deems to be very risky projects. By buying tokens or buying Bitcoin without, proving that they have a certain net worth, or that they're able to. So that basically, crypto was an eradication, and I speak crypto in general because it's not just Bitcoin. It is kind of the whole crypto kind of infrastructure, and that whole push and that wave of new projects. I mean, it made a lot of people a lot of money. A lot of people lost money. And it was kind of the Wild West. And I know regulators hate that because they can't control those projects. But for the first time, the flip side, people like you and I don't know about you, I'm not I don't know what the US uses. I'm not a sophisticated investor.
Accredited. Are you not
accredited investor? Right, fine. Yes. So I haven't been vetted as somebody who can take risk and decide for themselves what they want to do. Right. I'm deemed a lowly pleb who must be treated like
An idiot.
somebody who can't, an idiot. I have to be treated like an idiot because I'm not, whatever standards your country has for. So that means I can't participate in, pre-sales of stock or whatever. There's a lot of things I can't do. And that means, the people who are accredited get all the money, get all the glory, get all the returns. It's fantastic for them. And so looking at all this system led me to, well, how could regulation, how should it take place? We saw this wave of crypto projects and Bitcoin create new crypto millionaires who were not accredited investors. And it allowed people to assume the risk themselves that they wanted to take, which is great. I think that regulation shouldn't be, to a certain degree, shouldn't be mandatory. I think if you're, in a country, in a financial services, you want to invest in something, you want to know that the people are not criminals. There's a basis of kind of criminality that should be regulated by a country. But when it comes to, my net worth and whether or not I can assume a certain amount of risk, or if I should be allowed to participate in a project, I think that should be left to the individual. And so I wrote a paper which discusses a free market regulatory system, where basically it's just like a simple analogy is just the certified organic that you see in the stores, right? I mean, is that certified organic by government edict? Well, maybe, but in most cases it's not. It's an industry that got together and said, all right, we're going to create, organic standards, and we're going to go out, and if people want to have that little badge on their product, somebody's going to go and inspect their, the food that they use and that sort of thing, whatever standards they implement, and then they get the little badge. So why can't regulation be like that? And if I wanted to start my own certified organic standard because the other one sucks, I can. People can get together and we can say, look, the old one is pretty crappy for this and that reason. We're going to create a new certified organic standard and we're going to compete with the other one. And we can do that. And that's how free markets work. So when it comes to, regulation, if you're looking at a certain project, say, I don't know, developing an app and they're issuing stock or whatever, and you want to, as an investor, right, you want to know that there's a certain standard of criminality that's not going to happen. They're not lying to you openly, and they're not just going to take their money and run. And if they do, there's consequences. So that's fine. But when it comes to the audits of the accounts and kind of the nitty gritty of, who should be able to invest and how and all of that, and, what standards are applied to the particular project, I think industry is best placed for that, and competition would, allow a plethora or a large number of regulatory bodies who each have their own standards. It would weed out the good from the bad, and so I would know which, if I'm looking to invest some money, I'm going to look for the one that has badge A, because I know that badge A is a good badge to have. And if badge A becomes a bad badge to have because they're paid under the table, or the things that they certified in the past turn out to be bad, then there's going to be badge B that's going to compete with that. So I think regulation doesn't have to be centralized. The regulatory system that you have now certainly is used to fence off participants like you and I in certain circumstances. I think that's bad. So, regulation could be free market. Why isn't it? So just another thing that the sector could do. And going back, I'm sorry, I'm talking quite a bit here, but going back
I love it.
Going back how Bitcoin, got started, the ultimate certification, the ultimate regulator, Marty, is open source. You have for digital digital things like apps. That's the ultimate regulation. Anybody could pay. I mean, if you're going to invest $1 million in something, you can pay somebody $10,000 to go and audit the code. right, to see if there's any weaknesses. Does it work? And you can pay somebody else to assess the market. And, is it going to make money and all that? So you do your own due diligence. And the code being open is the kind of the number one regulation you can have in the digital space. Bitcoin's code is fully regulated by all the people who look at the code. So why are businesses, companies, new projects, very specifically in the Web3 space, pandering and begging for regulatory approval? I think that whole sector has lost its way. I think there are alternatives to the way it is now. I know the way it is now is very wrong. It is corrupt as far as I can tell, my personal opinion. I have no evidence of this. And so there are alternatives, and we don't have to ask for permission. That's a great thing. We can just go ahead and do it like Satoshi. Just do it. Don't ask for permission. And
yeah, and we've seen this try to manifest within Bitcoin in a couple of different ways, and I really love the framing of just like, think about it. I think we'd like to agree that open, free markets with competitive actors do produce better outcomes for the market overall. It's true for goods and services. Why wouldn't it be true for regulation too? And I think an example of something that tried to not necessarily self-regulate, but not really regulate, but self-report, the Bitcoin Mining Council is an example of an attempt to do that. And though I didn't agree with it, like it was a free market attempt at a solution to solve a problem that the mining industry had with people who did not understand the energy consumption profile of the Bitcoin mining industry. And personally, I think they were pandering too much to environmentalists and were sort of planting the flag saying that Bitcoin mining is going to use all renewable energy, when I knew that was not going to be the case in the long run. People are just going to use the cheapest energy, and that cheapest energy may not always be viewed as clean energy, depending on who you ask. But that is an attempt to self-regulate. Another example is not really regulation, but it is guidelines. The Bitcoin Design Guide exists out there. bitcoindesign.guide to sort of create best practices of what you should, what a wallet should include and how it should communicate what it has included to its users to make sure that they understand what they're doing as they interact with a Bitcoin wallet. And I think there's plenty of room for more of this. And I mean, down the hall here, Unchained Capital, we've seen many Bitcoin collateralized lending desks blow up because they rehypothecated their customer Bitcoin and gave it to degenerate gamblers. I think there's certainly an area which Unchained could lead and has led just from their product, but there could be loose standards or a stamp of approval that says if you're doing Bitcoin collateralized loans, unless you do it in this way where you have a low LTV, the collateral is in a multi-sig escrow that cannot be controlled. Unchained, HODL, Debify are producing solutions like this. There's certainly room for a Bitcoin lending, sort of not regulatory, but standard, free market standard guide to come out and say, if you're not doing it this way, you're not going to get our stamp of approval because the likelihood of you losing your customer funds is increased. If you do it this way, it's provable that it's not. I think that's a really good idea.
And those standards will develop and grow, and with awareness, investors and users will look for that, badge. And it's going to be an uphill battle for a while. I grant you that, where individuals are looking at, the SEC and the centralized regulator or government, to do one thing or the other. But it's my personal opinion that the government doesn't do anything. The way government does something is by getting out of the way and allowing people to do it. Whether it's a government functionary or some kind of elected representative, the government will say, well, yeah, you're allowed to do this, so go ahead and do it. The government itself doesn't really do much. It's people like you and I that do things. The government itself is a strange, nebulous kind of veil that people hide behind, or they worship, or they're scared of. Really, we're all human. The functionaries are human. The elected representatives are human. And we are the ones doing things. If you see a police officer in front of you, is that a police officer or is it a human? I don't know. We see the police officer, right? It's a veil. It's a veil that's put forward that you acknowledge, and it, removes liability from that human for his actions. If he acts unjustly. So this veil exists throughout government, and people kind of look at it and say, well, government is an actual entity. It has all this power. It's so big. No, it's the people, the humans that do things, that have the power and the ability to affect change, and that includes you. It includes me. It includes your viewers. Who can or choose to or not to send an FOI and get more information and hold their governments accountable, or develop apps or new standards. Go around and if you know a lot about code, you can look at the standards that you just mentioned and start auditing code that's open source, and put your badge and say, look, I've audited this. Here are my findings. Maybe there'll be a demand for that. And as people start doing that, you go, well, Coder John audited this and he agrees that this is a good wallet. People will start trusting Coder John because he's very impartial and does a good job at what he does and assessing and finding risks. And that's how a decentralized regulatory system would work. Now, my paper talks a lot about other things as well, measures that can be taken for enforcement, having some kind of bonds in place to ensure that the regulator, the entity issuing the certificate is held accountable, and to make sure that there's consequences to the person who receives the badge, if they act wrongly. So there has to be some degree of consequence, but I think that is just a wide open field, just waiting for solutions. And I think we should, grab a horse and gallop in that field instead of hiding behind the veil of government and waiting for that quote unquote entity to make our lives better.
If not you, then who? No, I completely agree. And I don't think what you said would come off as uncouth or disrespectful to this audience. It's objectively true. Most people are lazy. They want to, and I've been guilty of this myself. I've been lazy and have abdicated accountability to the government. It's an easy thing to point at and says, you're making this problem. But as you've very eloquently described on this podcast, like if you get up off your ass and actually take some action, whether it's the form of requesting information from the government or self-policing within an industry to create standards and marks of approval that people can abide by, like it's something that can be done. It's a wide open, empty canvas. It's just taking the initiative and the action to actually effectuate it into reality. And on that point too, talking about the web of trust, social graph, like that is beginning to manifest on Nostr, things like zap.store, which is basically an app store where you can download apps, the source code to apps. And what's budding there is a web of trust of people that have downloaded it, that are connected to you, and you can have that social signal. Okay, if Matt Odell and Jack Mahlers and NVK are downloading this app from this APK, I think it's safe for me to download this file. You extend that, like open source GitHub has been created on Nostr too. That was announced at Nostriga a few weeks ago. And so now you do have that ability to push code to an open source distributed GitHub via Nostr. And then on top of that, you have the social graph of the people reviewing and producing the code. And so you can begin to actually see these types of solutions coming to market. They're being built right now. It's just whether or not individuals take action to help build them or leverage them to make decisions when they download software or make decisions based off of others that do that.
The easiest decision for anybody to take is to download those apps. I have it on my phone, and it's great, works well. And even if it's not, it doesn't have all the functionalities of another big app store. I feel good at night knowing I'm using it. I use a de-Googled phone. I feel good at night knowing I'm using a de-Googled phone. I use Linux. I feel great knowing I'm using Linux. It's actually, as easy to use as Windows or iOS. And I know just by using it, I'm affecting change in the world. And that's magical. Whether or not I donate to the project or, devote my time to learning to code, which I would have to do if I was going to audit code. Even if I don't do that, your viewers can do really, really simple things. And it's just using a software. There's nothing worse for a developer, I imagine, than creating a great app and nobody uses it, right? And so just using it and getting the hell out of X and starting to use Nostr. I don't have an X account, never used one. I just have no interest. I think we're a ways away from people realizing the urgency of having to switch to alternative apps like you've just mentioned. I hope it's going to happen. Things may need to get worse before people realize it. That darn convenience is, really, really sweet. I think you mentioned you use an Apple product. So I'm pointing at you, right? It's very convenient. It's easy to use. I get it. But you're also probably leaking a ton of information and really allowing, maybe individuals to know more than they should about your goings on. And so, there is hope. I think the Bitcoin community, specifically the Nostr community, is doing amazing things. I'm really excited by it all. And what people can do is just use it. And yes, it's not as convenient in certain cases, but you're going to feel good at night going to bed, knowing that you've used an app that was created by somebody with the same values that you share. So the question is how does that propagate to the average individual? And hopefully just, with podcasts like this, you're doing a great job. You're doing the dirty work. You're moving it forward. Kudos to you. You are, a reason why I opted to go public. I have a perspective that hopefully adds some value. Maybe it wakes up one or two people who watch this. And if that's done, then great. I'm going to pat myself on the back, go to bed and feel good about what I've done. And it does feel good to change the world one little thing at a time. And I personally don't think it's going to be done by voting. I don't think it's going to be done by big, huge changes. It's going to be the small steps that mean the most in the long run. That's how millionaires get millions. It's not by making $1 million in one day. It's making $10 here and there. And it all adds up. So yeah, and I really want to thank you for the work that you're putting in, and in these podcasts, and also the projects that you back.
Well, I want to thank you for agreeing to come on the show and having the confidence to go public and have this discussion in the first place, because it is the most invigorating conversation I've had on the show in quite some time. And I really cherish the fact that you decided to come out and come on the show first and have this discussion, because I think it's an extremely important one, number one. And number two, I've had a number of these types of conversations in the past, and what I like most about your perspective and what you're putting out there is like it's actionable. It's actually a white pill. Like we can do this. There's little low-hanging fruit that you can take advantage of to actually affect positive change in your world. And I think this is a message that more and more people need to hear. And so I just want to thank you for coming on and being open to doing this in the first place. I think this is a very important conversation, and feeling very fired up now after the last hour and a half speaking with you about this. Very eloquent and level-headed. And it's just an incredible perspective considering your background and what you see on a day-to-day basis.
That's right. So you've heard things from, a lot of the speakers in the podcast world, but, and I guess people would have to trust you that you've done your due diligence on me because they can't see my face or know my name. But I've seen it from the inside. And, I am concerned about the trajectory, and not just the trajectory, but the attitude that people around me have, within my government. And I think, we can only do what we can do, and we will win. I hope so, for your kids.
Yeah. As long as we have I'm not fifth column actors like yourself who actually care. It is good and it's refreshing. Like there is still hope in the world. There's people like yourself that exist in these positions in different places around the world that do still have a soul and are actually cognizant of the effects of particular policy and regulations that get thrust on individuals around the world.
We all have a soul, and every single government bureaucrat, every single elected official, even Dr. Fauci has a soul. And it might be very deep, very, very deep in his case. My personal opinion, but he has a soul and he has a conscience, and it's looking past the veil of a uniform or title or government function, and looking at the humans, and that's how, and it's trusting them and forgiving them that will affect the most change. If people go up to me and say, well, your government did this, and that solidifies my position. I can't atone for what I've done. I'm being attacked. The best cure for a fire is water. And so it's looking past the veil, seeing the human, behind the veil, and kind of opening your arms to them or putting out a hand for a handshake. And I think that will go a long way. And sending an FOI.
Send your FOIs, freaks. Do it. I've got a couple in mind that I want to send. I won't say it on air. We'll see if it's successful. Announce it later. But thank you so much for doing this. Hopefully, anybody listening to this takes this message to heart and really decides to act. I think many people will. I'm sure we'll be getting messages and notes on Nostr about people submitting FOIs, and even on X, so it'll be syndicated there. But hopefully, if you ever want to come back on and feel compelled to talk about anything else in the future, you have an open invite, just let me know. And I feel honored to have had this conversation with you, and again, feeling invigorated and more hopeful than I was just a couple hours ago. So thank you.
It's my pleasure. I'm speaking at the Adopting Bitcoin in El Salvador as well.
Awesome.
And I'll be happy to meet people there, without this mask, and so they can see the human behind, this current veil that I'm wearing right now.
All right. Get to Adopting Bitcoin, freaks. Now I may try to come. That's all we got today. Thank you. And like I said, hopefully we can do this again in the future. Peace and love, freaks. Bitkey.